Okay, well, we're in Exodus chapter 7 this week. And in the previous chapter, we learned that God revealed himself to Moses as the Lord, Yahweh, or YHVH. We learned that that's the personal relationship or covenant name of God. In fact, he told Moses at the time that he had made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but that they lived in the land as strangers, not as those who possessed the land, and for that reason they didn't really know him as the covenant God. They didn't have intimate experiential knowledge of him. Then last week God delivered the 7 I will statements to Moses, the 7 covenants that he was making with the people of Israel who were currently under bondage. And he said, among other things, I am going to set you free, and I'm going to lead you to the land that I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They will learn from experience because they will go through the wilderness and eventually enter the land that's promised to them. They will know God experientially because of that. But the people of Israel refused to believe Moses because they were so discouraged from being in slavery to the Egyptians. And unfortunately, their unbelief kind of rubbed off on Moses. Remember, he said, God, you made a mistake. Obviously, he didn't know God very well. Lord, you made the mistake. You asked the wrong person to lead the people out of Israel. I'm not a good speaker, so let's try to find somebody else. However, before we get too hard on Moses, let's remember how many times we've accused God of not answering our prayers or answering them the wrong way. So we need to learn a thing or two from Moses. We as Christians know that our God is Elohim, the all-powerful creator God. We have a good understanding, or at least a growing understanding, of who he is. Now, keep in mind that at the time of the Exodus, Pharaoh and the people of Egypt believed that Pharaoh was a god, like one of their other gods, the river god and the sun god and the frog god. They even had an insect god. Now, we have to look at a couple of things in this interaction between Pharaoh and Moses, or actually Pharaoh and God. First of all, we have to look at the fact, or ask ourselves a question of, did God give Pharaoh free will? Now, he gives us free will as to whether or not we choose him. Now, those who believe in election would sometimes question that, but we still is our own free will that we choose him or not. Pharaoh had free will. And there will be times in this discourse between Pharaoh and Moses that it appears that God takes away that free will. We will see that he does not take away that free will until after Pharaoh has made his decision. Now also notice as we go through here that God does not force Pharaoh to admit that Elohim is a superior God. He will allow him to come to this conclusion all by himself. And this is where the subtle distinction between strength of heart and hardness of heart comes in. Now, if you read any English translation of the Bible throughout this interchange, it refers to to Pharaoh as hardening his heart. It uses that every time, even though there are 2 different expressions that are translated that way. One, as we've said before, one is chizuk halev, which literally means strengthening of heart, and the other is kibud halev, which means hardening of heart. Now, we can think of strengthening of heart as Pharaoh gaining courage and internal resolve to stay in the battle, whereas hardening of heart is Pharaoh becoming more obstinate and determined to resist. It's like the difference between being firm and resolute and being stubborn. I often tease my children that I learned at an early age that I am a person who is firm and resolute. For some reason, my children have grown up being stubborn. Like I said, to some degree, it's a matter of perspective. But it's also a matter of doing what we believe is right, morally correct at the time, that would be strength of heart, versus doing something whether we think it's right or wrong simply because we want to do it. That's stubbornness. One is based on absolute morality, whereas the other is based on selfish pride. So let's begin to look at these two as we go through the text of Exodus chapter 7. It starts out this way. And Yahweh said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet." There are a couple of different verbs in the Hebrew language that refer to making something. The Bible starts out with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That word created comes from the word that means to make something out of nothing. So God created everything that is out of nothing. Later on, we see that he made man from the dust of the earth. That's a different verb that means to form something from something else. This is a third verb that means to create, and what it literally means is to place or to set in place. So what he's saying is to Moses is, "I have set you as a god to Pharaoh." So he's not saying I'm making you permanently a god. And also notice that he said to Moses, "I'm placing you as Elohim, as a powerful, all-powerful creator type God, and I'm giving you authority to judge Pharaoh." Now, Moses was placed as a god, and it says Aaron, his brother, was placed as his prophet. Now, in the Hebrew, the word translated prophet is nabi, and it's consistently used to refer to someone who is inspired spokesman for God. And in every case, a prophet is nothing more than a spokesman for God. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. God goes on to tell Moses, "You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart." So he says to Moses, "You shall speak everything that I command you," which means you are a prophet as well. And since you are a god to Pharaoh, everything you tell Aaron, he will speak, therefore he will be your prophet. Now this time, the message to Pharaoh is not a request, "Please let my people go." It is a command. Moses and Aaron are to tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go," as a command. But Pharaoh is an absolute dictatorial ruler. He can do whatever he wants, and nobody is going to tell him what to do. So, of course, he's going to reject the message. Now, I said just a minute ago that Moses is also becoming like a prophet, just as Aaron is. If we look at the word prophet in the New Testament, it's the Greek word prophetes. Obviously, it's a transliteration, taking one word from one language and simply moving it to another language. But it's made up of the word pro, which means before, either in time or place, and phemi, which means to proclaim. So in the New Testament, and this applies to the Old Testament as well. A prophet is someone who stands before people and proclaims a message, but it's also someone who proclaims a message before it happens. So that's the type of prophecy that we normally think of, the prophecy of the future. But also notice that both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, God never gives the prophet all of the information. In fact, if we look in the New Testament, in 1 Peter, he says, concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours, they searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories. So even the prophets, when they predicted the suffering of the Messiah, they didn't understand it. And they searched their own scriptures to try to figure that out. Now, we've been saying before that the words hardening his heart and strengthening his heart don't come, or I'm sorry, the hardening of his heart in the English translation don't always come from the same words. It could be either strengthening or hardening. Now, in this example, when God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, it really means harden. You say, but that doesn't sound like God giving Pharaoh free will. We will find out that God doesn't actually harden Pharaoh's heart until after Pharaoh has proclaimed that God is Elohim and that he, Pharaoh, is a sinner. It's after that point that God actually hardened his heart, and we'll get into that. And then God tells Moses, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. He gives him a little bit of history in advance. He said, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh. They will have intimate experiential knowledge of who I am when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. Now, why does God tell Moses ahead of time what's going to happen? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, when it does happen, it will increase Moses' faith because God told him this is what's going to happen, and so when it happens, okay, God, you said it would, so I believe you. Secondly, it will demonstrate who the real Elohim, Creator God, is. It's not Pharaoh. He's just one of these lesser gods, called a god, but he's not really God. But it will demonstrate that our God is the Creator God, and that will further increase Moses and Aaron's faith. It also tells Moses and Aaron ahead of time what's going to happen so that they can be strong when it appears like things are going wrong. It's not unlike our faith today. I'm wearing a shirt that says, I've read the final chapter. God wins. We know that because he has told us ahead of time. Now, I'm sure we've all gone through this. Now, when I was in grade school, although then we called it grammar school because they actually taught grammar back then, something that is woefully lacking today in our school systems. But back then, I remember at recess, we would all go outside and they would choose two people, usually the two most athletic, to pick teams, and they would go back and forth choosing one person after another. And I'm sure many of you were standing by the side saying, I want him to pick me because he's really good and I want to be on the winning team, right? We already know that we're on the winning team when it comes down to the most important battle in life. God has already won. It's just that the world doesn't know that yet. someday they will. Now, God has also revealed to us that he will not only take us out of the way, but he will then come back and judge sin completely. For that reason, we can keep our focus on the goal. And Paul described it this way in Philippians, "Brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind." Forget about what's already happened. I strain forward to what lies ahead. I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Jesus Christ. We know that very soon Jesus is coming to the atmosphere and he will call us upward. But even if we die before he raptures us, we know that when we die, we will be called upward. We will head to paradise. And Paul says, that's what I keep my focus on. Not the things that are happening around me, not the failures that I've had in life, but on God's ultimate victory. And our text then tells us Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as Yahweh commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron was 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. We see here a new state that Moses and Aaron have entered into. No, I don't mean that they've finally come to Oregon. They have faith. They, instead of arguing with God now, they simply did what he said to do. And now it tells us that Moses was 80 years old when these things happened. This gives us a real key about Moses' life. Remember, the first 40 years of his life, he was raised in the household of Pharaoh. He was somebody special. He was even commander of the army in at least one battle. He was the elite. Then, for the next 40 years, he was sent off to be a shepherd over a bunch of mindless sheep, which was also important training for him. Because the last 40 years of his life, he had to lead the children of Israel through the wilderness. So this tells us here there's a demarcation point and things are going to change for Moses. Then Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, 'Prove yourselves by working a miracle,' then you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent.'" Once again, God is telling Moses and Aaron ahead of time what's going to happen. Pharaoh's going to say, "I want you to prove that you're from God by doing a miracle in front of me." And that's what they're going to do. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. These two are growing in their faith, aren't they? Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. We'll talk about that in a second. So when Moses and Aaron now stand before Pharaoh, he commands them to do a miracle. So Aaron took the staff which had been Moses, his shepherd's crook, and he cast it down and it became a serpent. Well, the Hebrew word is taniyim, which means a snake or a dragon, or it could mean something that lives in the water. Now, some people have said because of that these didn't become snakes, they became alligators because one of them ate another one up. Well, snakes have been known to eat other snakes. And they eat them alive. That's really weird. But you remember also that we talked previously that one of the crowns for the Egyptians had a cobra called Uraeus on the front that was a symbol of authority and power and ruling ability and godness, deity. So by performing this miracle in front of Pharaoh, Moses was claiming that he had power and authority and godlike authority over the children of Israel. But Pharaoh didn't want to be outdone. So he called over his 2 wise men, and incidentally, we have evidence that their names were Jannes and Jambres. Let me explain that. The Old Testament that the Jews believed in, the first 5 books they referred to as the Torah, the law. The second set of books was the prophets. And the third set of books was the writings. And you put all 3 of those together and you have what we call the Old Testament. They referred to that as the Tanakh. Now, way back, some of their leading rabbis took the Tanakh, the whole Old Testament, and they wrote notes in the margin explaining things. And these versions of the Tanakh then became known as the Targum. Now, a Targum is sort of like a study Bible today. If you have a Schofield Reference Bible or a MacArthur Study Bible or a Thompson Chain Reference Bible, you have a Bible with some notes added into it. That's what the Targums were. And probably the most famous of the Targums was the one written by a rabbi named Jonathan. And the Targum of Jonathan said that these 2 Egyptian magicians were Jannes and Jambres. But we have more evidence of that. In Paul's letter to Timothy, he said, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses. So there is significant evidence that we know who these 2 magicians were. Now, after Jannes and Jambres threw down their staffs and they became snakes, we kind of skip over this sometimes, but what happened was that the snake from Aaron's rod ate up the other 2. And what does this say about our God? It says he's more powerful than the gods of Egypt. Still, it says, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them. Now this is the first time we encounter the Hebrew expression chizuk halev, which means strengthened. So still Pharaoh's heart was strengthened. He gained courage because he saw his own magicians reproduce this miracle that Aaron had just done. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And that's a correct translation this time. So what's the deal? Does God not really know what's happening here? It's actually a matter of perspective. From Pharaoh's standpoint, he was encouraged and his heart was strengthened when he saw Jannes and Jambres produce this miracle. But from God's perspective, he was just resisting God. Now, let's use our sanctified imaginations here for just a minute and imagine what these 2 said to Pharaoh when when Aaron threw down his staff. They might have said something like this, "Not to worry, my lord. This is nothing but a magic trick, and we can do the same thing. Here, watch." And so they threw down their staffs and they became snakes. So Pharaoh would be encouraged by his 2 magicians. And when Aaron's rod ate the other 2 up, he apparently was not impressed because his magicians had reproduced the same miracle. Now, apparently, the Lord speaks to Moses and Aaron right after this. And he says this, "Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water. Stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that turned into a serpent. And you shall say to him, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, the Elohim of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But so far you have not obeyed. Thus says Yahweh, by this you shall know that I am Yahweh. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood. The fish in the Nile shall die, and the Nile will stink. And the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. It's possible that Pharaoh went down to the Nile every day to offer an offering to the god of the Nile, of the river. Or maybe he went down there periodically to bathe or whatever. In any event, God knew that he was going the next day, and he told Moses and Aaron, go down there and meet him. Now we need to understand that there was an annual event that occurred in the Nile. During the flood season, it would increase the volume of water coming down there, would flood the land around there. And the water would actually change color during this time. Instead of being a murky green color, it would gradually turn clear as the new water came in. And then as the microorganisms multiplied, it would eventually turn to a red color. Now, Pharaoh knew this, as did all the people in Egypt, so he might not have been too surprised when the water turned red. However, it didn't just change color. It actually became blood. And it wasn't just the river, it was all the lakes and ponds, and even the water that was in the water pots for the people turned to blood. And the way they knew it wasn't just a red color is because the fish died. They couldn't breathe. So the whole area began to stink. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. Now it sounds like he hammered the water with, but that's not what the word means. It means it's like someone being struck with a disease. It means he caused the water in the Nile, and all the water in the Nile turned to blood, and the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout the land of Egypt. Remember, the Nile represented their god, one of their gods. Osiris was their main god, and he was the god of fertility and the god of life. And now this god who ruled over the river Nile turned to blood, death instead of life. Also, the main source of protein for the people in Egypt was fish. And with all the fish dying, they would be deprived of one of their food sources. But the magicians turned around, and I don't know where they found the clean water. Maybe they dug by the side of the river and filtered it out like others did. But they took water and they turned it to blood as well. They duplicated this miracle for a second time. So let's go back to our sanctified imagination and listen to this conversation. They said to Pharaoh, "Not to worry, my lord. Once again, it's nothing but a magic trick. We can do the same trick, see?" And they turned clear water into blood. So it says, as the Pharaoh turned and went into his house and did not even take this to heart. It says before that, so Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Again, that's an incorrect translation. His heart remained strengthened. So Pharaoh is gaining courage from his wise men being able to duplicate these miracles, and he's not yet become hardened, but he is becoming more and more confident in himself. And it says, all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. Then it says something curious. 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. Some people have read that and said that this water turned to blood lasted for 7 days. That's not what it says. This is one of those cases where the original language was written without any chapter or verse divisions, both in the Hebrew and the Greek. And men later on came along and made these artificial divisions. This one was made in the wrong spot. The division should have been at the end of the word Nile, and all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. Period. The next chapter should start 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile, because the very next words are, then the Lord said to Moses. So what we're being told is 7 days after this miracle of turning the water to blood, God once again spoke to Moses. So we need to be careful as we read the scripture. Well, so what? Here we see Pharaoh refusing to submit to God. We would never do that, would we? In fact, we do it frequently. And when we do, quite often we get the feeling of, I got away with it, right? Because God doesn't immediately strike us dead or cause us to get sick or cause our dog to die or anything like that. We get away with it. And as a result, we gain confidence between us and God. That's called strength of heart. But if we're not careful, this can sometimes turn to stubbornness, hardness of heart. And when we get stubborn with God, that's when our fellowship gets broken. That's when we go through times of sin and we don't confess it because we don't feel like we really need to, or it wasn't that big a sin. I mean, all I did was tell a little fib just so I wouldn't hurt somebody's feelings. Eventually, God causes us to face that. And when that happens, we lose that fellowship with God. We lose that peace that we have with God. We lose that desire for more of God. So let me ask you this. Do you crave fellowship with God? We all do at times. But when you're in those low moments, when things don't seem to be going well for you, do you really want to seek God out through His Word? Do you have an insatiable desire for the Bible? Or do you lack the time or desire, perhaps, to read your Bible? You know about God, but do you really know God at those times? Are you worried about your finances or what the future might bring? Does this peace of God seem elusive or maybe non-existent to you? That should be a hint to you that there's something that's come between you and God. We see here in the life of Aaron and Moses that once they were completely submitted to God, they were not concerned about the apparent failure of their actions to produce the results they wanted from Pharaoh. That wasn't a big thing to them anymore. They knew that God was in control. And they kept their eyes fixed on Him. When we have our eyes fixed on God, and we recognize that He is Almighty God and that we are sinful man and we confess our sins, it produces a lack of concern. Now, Pharaoh refused to submit to the will of Yahweh because he didn't want to. He didn't think he had to. He allowed his heart to be progressively strengthened against God until it became hardened. Only by completely submitting to God can we know the peace of God. You can't have it both ways. We can't say we're a Christian and we're living a Christian life and yet allow sin to control us in our lives. Now, we are all indwelt by a sin nature. We can't get away from that. It will cause us to sin because we will be tempted. In fact, James says each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. He could have said sinful nature. Then desire, when it's conceived, gives birth to sin. We don't have to let our sin nature control us. It will, but we don't have to just give up and let it run its course. We can resist it. James says, therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness and receive with meekness the implanted word. Here's the key, being in the word, which is able to save your souls. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. We know what the future brings. We know it won't always be pretty. We know that the way things are going in the world today, it's getting more and more ungodly. In fact, Cameron Burr, is that right, his name? He recently wrote a children's book. And he went to libraries and said, I'd like to have this book included in your daily readings for children. And he went to library after library after library, and they all said, no, we won't do it. Because this goes against our readings when we have drag queens come in here and read about that lifestyle. So we don't want your Christian book in here. And today, more and more, the word Christian is becoming a bad word. We're being looked down on by the world as being radicals and being intolerant, and being against what this country stands for. And that's because Satan has got a grip on the world system today. So we know that's going to happen, and it's going to get worse. But we also know, ultimately, God is going to get the victory. Someday soon, he will call us up, and we will just leave this earth, and we'll let the world go, pardon the expression, to hell in a handbasket all by itself, because we're going to be with the Lord. So we need to be careful and not let sin sidetrack us. When we slip, we need to confess it and recommit to submitting to God and committing our life to him. We need to make sure that we keep our hearts soft and focus on him. Let's pray.